Hi everybody, this is Wanda and I just wanted to say welcome to this week's episode of Bible Briefs. I know you're here for the story, so let's get right into it. Sometime after God confused the languages of the people and spread them across the world, he spoke to a 75-year-old man named Abraham and said, "Abraham, leave your people, your family, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you famous, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to others. Anyone who treats you with contempt, I will curse, and anyone who blesses you, I will bless. And all people on earth will be blessed through you." And even though Abraham and his wife had no children, they packed up all their stuff, all their animals, all their servants, and Abraham's nephew Lot, and they set out as God had directed. They traveled for a while, and then came to the land of Canaan. And God spoke to Abraham again when they got there and said, "This is the land that I'm going to give to your descendants." Abraham traveled throughout the land, building several altars to God as he went. Then a famine hit, and Abraham had to go live in Egypt for a bit. On their way into Egypt, Abraham says to his wife Sarah, "Honey, you're such a hottie. If they know we're married, those Egyptians will kill me so they can have you. So tell them you're my sister. Then they'll treat me well to try to get you." And he was right. When they got to Egypt, Sarah's beauty was the talk of the town. When Pharaoh heard about the new hottie in town, he added her to his harem, and he gave her brother many valuable gifts. But when God sent terrible plagues on Pharaoh's house because of Sarah, Pharaoh somehow found out the truth. So he summoned Abraham, gave him back his wife, and banished them both from Egypt. With all the wealth they gained in Egypt, Abraham and Lot's flocks had grown so big that there just wasn't enough food and water for all those animals, and their herdsmen started fighting over the limited resources. Finally, Abraham said to Lot, "We've got to split up to stop this fighting, so take your pick. You go one way, I'll go the other." Lot chose the fertile plains of the Jordan River Valley and settled near Sodom. After Lot left, God spoke to Abraham again and said, "Look around. Everything, as far as you can see, I'm giving to you and your descendants permanently, and you're going to have more descendants than there is dust." Shortly after this, Sodom was attacked, and Lot was also captured. When Abraham heard about it, he chased the invaders and recaptured all that was taken. On his way back, he was met by the king of Sodom and also the king of Salem, Melchizedek, who was a priest of God Most High. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave him a tenth of what he recovered. The king of Sodom asked for just his people back, but Abraham gave him both goods and people back, so he couldn't say that he'd made Abraham rich. About 10 years had passed since God first spoke to Abraham. And though God kept repeating his promise to Abraham that he'll have many descendants, Abraham and Sarah still don't have any children. So Sarah decides they should try a leading ancient fertility treatment, which is, "Here, take my slave and she can have your babies for me." And it works. Sarah's slave girl Hagar gets pregnant and stops showing any respect to Sarah. Sarah is furious and tells Abraham it's all his fault. But Abraham tells her, "She's your slave. Do what you want with her." Well, Sarah's response was to make life so miserable for Hagar that she ran away. But God's angel came and told her to go back, so she returned and gave birth to a son named Ishmael. Another 13 years go by, and God speaks again to Abraham, reaffirming all he had said and sealing it as an unbreakable promise to Abraham and his descendants forever, as long as they keep their part of the bargain, which is to have every male circumcised as a mark of this promise, either when they're 8 days old or when they become part of the household. That same day, Abraham, his son Ishmael, and all the male servants in Abraham's household were circumcised. That same year, God appeared again to Abraham in disguise. One day, a now 99-year-old Abraham saw 3 men approaching. He went out to welcome them and invited them to make a pit stop in his camp to rest and eat something. They agreed, and Abraham had a nice meal prepared for them. While they were eating, one of them said to Abraham, "I'll come back in about a year, and then Sarah will have a son." Sarah heard this while sitting in the tent and laughed to herself because she knew they were both too old to have a baby. Then God said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, 'Can an old woman like me have a baby?' Is there anything too hard for God? I'll be back, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid and denied laughing, but God knew better. After the meal, the men left, and Abraham went with them to see them off. God decided he shouldn't hide what was about to happen from Abraham, so he told him, "I hear of such evil in Sodom and Gomorrah that I'm going to go see if it's true." The two other men headed for Sodom, but God stayed with Abraham. And Abraham said to God, "You wouldn't wipe out the good men with the evil, would you? What if there are 50 good men in that city? Will you destroy them along with the rest of the city? How could you? That wouldn't be right or just." And God says, "If there are 50 good men, I'll spare the whole city." Then Abraham says, "Well, what if there are a few shy of 50? What if there are only 45 good men? Would you destroy it all just for lack of 5 good men?" And God says, "For the sake of 45 good men, I'll spare the whole city." And Abraham keeps on like this until he's down to just 10 good men. And God assures him that if there are 10 good men in Sodom, then he won't destroy the city. That evening, the other 2 men, who were really angels in disguise, reached Sodom. Abraham's nephew Lot was sitting at the gate, and when he saw them, he invited them to stay at his home. They protested and said they'd just sleep in the square, but Lot insisted, and they finally gave in. Before they went to bed, all the men in Sodom formed a mob and surrounded Lot's house, demanding, "Bring out the 2 visitors so we can all sleep with them." Lot goes out and tries to dissuade the crowd, begging them not to do such an evil thing to guests who are under his protection. But they threaten him and go to break down the door. The angels quickly grab Lot and drag him back inside. Then they strike the mob blind and it disperses. Then the angels told Lot to warn any relatives in town to get out immediately because God was going to destroy the city. But those Lot tried to warn thought he was joking. Finally, at dawn, the angels drag Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters out of the city and tell them, "Run for the mountains. Don't look back and don't stop." But as God destroyed Sodom by raining down fire and burning sulfur on it, Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters escaped and settled alone in the mountains, and their children founded the nations of the Moabites and the Ammonites, who will turn up later in our story. Sarah also had her baby Isaac, just as God promised she would, when she was 90 and Abraham was 100. And soon she demanded of Abraham, "Send Hagar and Ishmael away. My son isn't splitting his inheritance with a slave woman's son." Abraham didn't want to send his son away, but God told him Sarah was right. Isaac was the one that would inherit God's promises, and Hagar and Ishmael were sent away. Sometime later, God spoke to Abraham again and told him, "Take your son Isaac, who you love so very, very much, and travel to the land of Moriah. There you are to sacrifice him as a burnt offering on the mountain that I show you." Abraham got up early the next morning, saddled his donkey, chopped wood for the sacrifice, and set out on the journey with Isaac and 2 of his servants. On the 3rd day, God showed him the place of sacrifice, and he told his servants to stay with the donkey while he and Isaac went a little farther to worship, then they'd be back. Abraham had Isaac carry the wood, while he carried the knife and the hot coals to start the fire. On their way, Isaac asks him, "Dad, we've got everything else, but where's the animal for the sacrifice?" And Abraham tells him, "God will provide a lamb for the sacrifice." When they finally arrive at the place God showed Abraham, Abraham builds the altar and arranges the wood, then ties Isaac up and lays him on the altar. He's got the knife in his hand, ready to kill him, when a voice from heaven says, "Abraham, don't hurt the boy. Now I know how deep your reverence runs. You'd even give me your only son." And Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in a thicket, and he sacrifices that animal on the altar instead. And he named that place Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. Then God reaffirmed all his promises to Abraham again, saying, "Because you have obeyed me in this, I swear that I will bless you and give you more descendants than there are stars in the sky or sand on the shore. They will defeat their enemies, and through them I will bless all the peoples of the earth." Eventually, Sarah died. Abraham bought some land and buried her in a cave on that land. A few years later, Abraham called his most trusted servant and made him swear to travel back to Abraham's homeland to find a wife for Isaac and to bring her back. So the servant loaded 10 camels down with expensive gifts and set off. He eventually came to the town where Abraham's brother's family lived. As evening approached and the women would be coming out to get water, he prayed that God would give him this sign, that when he asked for a drink, the woman God had chosen to be Isaac's wife would not just give him a drink, but offer to water all his camels as well. No sooner had he finished praying than this beautiful girl named Rebecca comes out for water. He asks her for a drink, and when he finishes drinking, she says, "I'll get water for your camels too, until they've drunk their fill." Hoping that God has answered his prayer, he gives her some gold jewelry and asks about her family and if they might have room for a guest. He's thrilled to learn that she's the granddaughter of Abraham's brother. And next thing you know, she's told her family, and her brother Laban has come out to welcome the man to stay with them. Before even eating dinner, he insists on telling them about his mission to find a wife for Isaac, and how he prayed and how Rebekah fulfilled the sign. Upon hearing all this, her family agreed that this was God at work, and agreed to send Rebekah to be Isaac's wife. The next morning, Abraham's servant left with Rebekah and her servant girls on the journey back to Abraham and Isaac. When they arrived, the servant told the tale of all that had happened, and Isaac took Rebekah as his wife and loved her. And with Isaac, it was kind of a case of like father, like son. He pulled the, "Hey, howdy wife, say you're my sister so people don't kill me to get you" thing once when they were forced to live among foreigners for a bit. And just like his father, he had a wife who had trouble getting pregnant. Isaac prayed, and finally, after 19 years of marriage, Rebekah became pregnant. But it was a really rough pregnancy. So bad that she asked God why it was so horrible, and God told her that the 2 sons inside of her were the start of 2 rival nations, and that the older son would serve the younger. And when the babies were born, the first out was covered in hair, almost like fur, and he was named Esau, which means hairy. The second came out gripping the first one's heel, so he was called Jacob, which means heel grabber, or more figuratively, deceiver. Esau grew up to be an outdoorsman and hunter who became his father's favorite because his father loved that tasty wild game. Jacob was a quiet homebody who became his mother's favorite. And one night when they were grown, Jacob was cooking some stew when Esau came in from the hunt, tired and hungry. The stew smelled really good, and Esau told Jacob to give him a bowl. "I will, if you swap inheritances with me so I get the firstborn share," Jacob replied. "I'm about to starve to death. What good is my inheritance to me?" was Esau's reply. Jacob had Esau swear an oath to swap the inheritances, then gave Esau the stew. Isaac grew old and blind. One day he called Esau to him and said, "I'm getting old and don't know how much longer I have. Go hunting so you can make my favorite meal for me. When you bring it to me, I'll give you the blessing reserved for the firstborn." But Rebekah overheard this and plotted to get the blessing for Jacob. She used 2 goats to prepare Isaac's favorite meal and dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes. Then she covered his smooth skin with goat hide to make it hairy like Esau's, and sent him in with the meal she had made. Jacob approached, claiming to be Esau, and though Isaac started with some misgivings, since the voice was Jacob's voice, he was eventually convinced enough to give his blessing to Jacob. That was when Esau returned from his hunt and prepared his dish. But when he brought it to Isaac, Isaac realized that he had been tricked. Esau cried and begged for a blessing, but all Isaac could give him as a blessing was to say he would serve his brother, but when he decided to free himself, he'd shake off that yoke. Esau's main comfort was plotting how he would kill his brother after their father died. When Rebekah learned of this, she knew she had to get Jacob away from his brother. So she told Isaac she didn't want Jacob to marry local women like his brother had done, but to go back to her family to find a wife. So Isaac blessed Jacob and sent him off to his relatives. When Jacob stopped for the night, he dreamed of a stairway reaching up to heaven. God stood at the top, and angels traveled up and down the stairway. Then God spoke to him and said, "I'm the God of your grandfather Abraham and your father Isaac. All the families on earth will be blessed through your descendants. I am with you and will protect you wherever you go, and one day I'll bring you back to this land." When Jacob woke the next morning, he named that place Bethel, which means house of God, and he vowed that if God would do as he promised, then Jacob would most certainly worship him. Jacob was warmly welcomed to the home of Laban when he arrived. He started helping out with the flocks, and after about a month, Laban insisted on paying him for his labor and told Jacob to name his price. Jacob had fallen in love with Laban's younger daughter Rachel and said he'd work 7 years if at the end of it he could marry Rachel. It was agreed, and those 7 years just flew by for Jacob. Finally, the 7 years were up. Laban invited the whole neighborhood for a wedding feast, and that night, after dark, he brought the bride to Jacob, and they spent the night together. But in the morning, Jacob discovered that it wasn't Rachel. He'd been tricked and had been given Leah, the older sister, as his wife. He was absolutely furious with Laban and confronted him. Laban explained that he just couldn't let the younger daughter marry before the oldest did, but Jacob could marry Rachel as well. He'd just have to work another 7 years to pay for that second wife. Jacob agreed, and the next week he married Rachel, and he loved her far more than her sister. God saw Leah wasn't loved and enabled her to have children, but Rachel had a hard time getting pregnant. After Leah had had 4 children, Rachel was desperate enough to use that favorite ancient fertility treatment and sent her maid in her place to have her children. Her maid had a couple kids, and Leah had stopped having kids, so Leah sent her maid in to have some kids for her. And pretty soon, it's an all-out baby-having competition between the two sisters. 10 sons were born before God remembered Rachel, and she got pregnant and gave birth to a boy she named Joseph. During this time, Jacob finished his service for Laban and wanted to return home. But Laban was getting rich from God's blessing Jacob's work and didn't want to see him go. Laban agreed to give him part of the flock, but then quickly spirited away that part of the flock to relatives several days away. And any time it seemed like Jacob was getting ahead on the deal, Laban changed the terms of what Jacob's wages would be. This went on for 6 years, and Laban's attitude towards Jacob was clearly changing. Then one day God spoke to Jacob and told him it was time to go home. So Jacob and his family left secretly while Laban was away. It was 3 days before Laban found out about it, but he gathered his relatives and set off in pursuit. When Laban caught up to them, he asked, "What's the idea of sneaking off like that? You didn't even let me say goodbye to my daughters and grandchildren. I could destroy you, but God warned me in a dream last night to leave you alone." And Jacob replied, "I was afraid you'd force your daughters to stay if you knew we were planning to leave. I worked for you 20 years, but you kept changing my wages, and if God wasn't on my side, you would have sent me away with nothing. But God saw what you did, and that's why he appeared to you last night and told you to leave me alone." And Jacob and Laban made an agreement not to harm each other. The next morning, Laban kissed his daughters and grandchildren goodbye and blessed them. Then he returned home. Having dealt with one angry family member, Jacob turned his thoughts to the next one and sent messengers to his brother Esau to inform him of his coming and find out whether he would receive a friendly welcome. The messengers returned and told Jacob that Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob was terrified and split everything up into 2 groups and prayed that God would rescue him from Esau. Then he took 550 animals to send as gifts to Esau to appease him and split them into multiple herds. He told the men to keep plenty of space between the herds and that when they met Esau, to tell him that these were gifts from Jacob, who was coming right behind them. Jacob then sent his wives, children, and all his possessions across the river for protection, while he remained alone in the camp. Then a man appeared and wrestled with Jacob until dawn. Seeing that he wouldn't win, the man dislocated Jacob's hip with a touch. Then he tells Jacob, "Let me go, it's nearly dawn." But Jacob replies, "I won't let go until you bless me." So the man asks Jacob his name, and after Jacob gives it, the man says to him, "From now on, you will be called Israel, because you fought with God and men and won." Jacob asks the man his name, but the man won't give it, only saying in response, "Why do you want to know my name?" And he blesses Jacob. When this is over, Jacob looks up and sees Esau and his 400 men are very close. He puts his women and children in a line and then goes to meet Esau, bowing as he goes. But Esau runs to meet him and throws his arms around him. After some catching up, Esau offers him an escort back to his home, but Jacob refuses, saying that the animals and children will need to travel slowly, and he has plenty of men to guard them. Jacob eventually returned to Bethel, where God appeared to him the first night he fled home and built an altar there. And God appeared to him again there, reaffirming his name of Israel, and that he was the heir of the promises that God made to Abraham and Isaac. They journeyed some more, and Rachel, who had become pregnant again, went into labor. It was a very difficult labor, and even though she gave birth to a son named Benjamin, she died shortly thereafter. Jacob buried Rachel and marked her grave with a stone monument. Then he continued traveling until he finally arrived back home where his father Isaac was living. There he stayed and raised his family. Now that the story's over, it's time for our processing questions. So, here are our processing questions. Feel free to think through them yourself, or if you're listening to this with a group, pause the audio and talk amongst yourselves about these. What did you like about this story? What did you not like or find confusing and uncomfortable in this story? What did you learn about God from this story? What did you learn about people from this story? And what does God want you to do in light of this story? Now, there's just one last thing before you go, and that is if you are enjoying this series and you find it beneficial, I'd really appreciate it if you would like, subscribe, and share this with your friends. And I will catch you on the next episode of Bible Briefs.